Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to today's Scrum Pulse webinar. I'm Lindsay Vellicina, and I'll be your host today. And today we have Mia Horrigan and Matthew Hodgson, and they'll be presenting How Do You Know If You're Really Agile? Next slide. Okay. So some just quick housekeeping items before we get started. Your microphones will be muted throughout, and the session is recorded. So you will receive the recording within 24 hours. We'll also share it on our social media channels. And please submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do some Q&A during this webinar, and any questions that we don't get to, we'll answer offline later. Next slide. So a little bit about Scrum.org. In case you are not familiar with us, we offer training and certification for Scrum and a wide variety of free resources to continue your Scrum learning. Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum, is our founder. We have over 340 professional Scrum trainers worldwide, and they consistently teach the same material. So no matter where you go around the world to take a class or taking one virtually, which many of them are right now, you'll be getting the same experience. And you can learn more about our courses, certifications, and resources on our website. And with that, I will kick it over to Mia and Matt to get us started.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. As Lindsay said, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Matthew Hodgson, and I'm the CEO of Xenex Machina. And with me is Executive Vice President and my Chief Operating Officer, Mia Horrigan. Today, we're going to have a look at and essentially answer the question of how do you know if you're actually really agile? How do you know if your teams, your programs, and your enterprise is agile? Because when we take an enterprise perspective, the kinds of things that executives and boards are truly interested in are things like productivity. They're interested to know whether or not the kinds of initiatives and the activities that you're doing, is it actually going to provide financial benefits? Is it going to provide business benefits in relation to improved ability to pivot, improve throughput, faster time to market? Is it going to, in relation to cost, reduce the time requirement to deliver an outcome, to deliver benefits and outcomes for customers, for stakeholders, and for business? Are we going to see things like a lower investment needed in relation to strategic initiatives? Are we going to actually see lower operational costs to sustain the work and the products that we're doing? And importantly, the third thing the C-suite are looking for in terms of the outcomes and impacts are things like lower organizational risk, lower technical risk, lower delivery risk, and importantly, greater transparency. So if these are the metrics that executives really care about, what kind of metrics do we normally capture? Do projects actually provide some kind of insight in terms of agility for these kinds of impacts? And things like schedule, cost, scope, budget, percentage complete, stage complete, how far are we up to, risk in terms of RAG. Typical project metrics are really great for activity, reflecting on what has happened, deliverables, efficiencies. But something that it doesn't look at, something that project metrics don't measure, are these kinds of perspectives around the future impact trends, outcomes and benefits, productivity, and importantly, being able to use these to predict likely outcomes in the future. What about our agile software tools? I'm sure a lot of you use them. And again, burn up, burn down, velocity, cumulative flow, numbers of stories complete, defects, etc. Again, great metrics for activity and output. But what about for outcomes? Productivity trends, predictability, transparency. These kinds of metrics don't predict enterprise agility. probably familiar with lots of Agile surveys, and I've seen quite a few, and they ask about the work that has been delivered, are you compliant with standards, perceptions of quality, do you attend Scrum events like sprint planning, and do you do daily Scrum, or customer happiness or team happiness? And these are great for self-reflection and for team reflection. But in terms of outcomes, do they actually predict outcomes, how we're going to trend towards future things? And these kind of metrics suffer from things like Dunning-Kruger, cognitive bias. And again, they don't predict enterprise agility, the kinds of things that executives expect around ability to pivot, cost savings, enterprise profile risks. What does it take to be and have stronger agility? So to measure these kinds of enterprise agility effects, we actually need different kinds of metrics. What we've just looked at are things called descriptive analytics, and this is from a data analytics perspective. Velocity, activity, efficiency, metrics, delivery, all of these are about hindsight. What has happened? To answer these questions around why are some teams more successful, what will make teams agile, and importantly, if we understand what will make teams agile, what about recommendations to make these things repeatable? For that, data analytics provides us some kinds of clues. Diagnostic analytics, predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, all of these reinforce to us a different perspective is needed. Statistical models are important to answer these questions, as well as aspects of data rules engines, neural networks, AI. These kinds of things enable us to ask these questions and answer them. So about a decade ago, we had a hypothesis. We thought, could we actually generate a data analytics model to actually ask what are some of the factors that we're able to measure that are going to predict enterprise agility? What are some of the metrics that we should use? So that we can say certain things are strongly correlated with outcomes that at an enterprise level, we actually really care about: reduction in costs, improvability to pivot, reduction in rework, reduction in defects. And lastly, what is it that's going to be able to predict what kinds of behaviors, if we see them, are going to actually say, yes, these strong behaviors and trends towards these kinds of behaviors are going to be able to describe how programs evolve to become more agile, to be able to, at an enterprise level, actually deliver agility outcomes. And lastly, provide us insights, recommendations to create repeatable, scalable behaviors, particularly at scale across the enterprise. Now, these kinds of models, because we're dealing with human behavior, then we're not dealing with simple correlation. Human models have multiple factors. If we think about things from medicine around what are the kind of factors that predict in medicine, heart attacks, coronary disease, these are complex models, many factors that when we plug them all in, it provides us an ability to predict whether or not someone's at risk. And so this is what we turn to. Importantly for human systems, we turn to psychology, organizational culture. We looked at and we took from Wacefizz's model of that we would expect to see from symbols through behaviors and attitudes and rituals, beliefs, different kinds of behaviors. And that these behaviors would take time to evolve and change. We wanted to be able to incorporate behaviors at all of these levels, not just go, oh, our team's happy. Oh, if teams are happy, then they'll be agile. Well, a little bit more complex than that. There are many human factors that we felt. So we took from the science of psychology of human behavior to try to understand what are these factors that help us predict if we're headed towards good, strong agility at enterprise level. So we created an inventory of 85 questions from a range of sources, from the Agile Manifesto through the Scrum Guide, various iterations over the last decade, extreme programming, systems thinking, management 3.0, lean Kanban. We took questions from these key sources. And importantly, post hoc, we looked at questions that didn't contribute significantly towards behavior. Did they provide us and explain a significant amount of the correlation in the model? We removed the questions that didn't. And use techniques from psychology to actually collect the data. We didn't rely on self-assessment because we knew the science ultimately says that in self-assessment, people suffer from a cognitive bias. So we took experts, we did expert review, naturalistic observation, diary studies, contextual inquiry from professional agile consultants who understood what behavior they were observing and could actually comment on it using these techniques. The kinds of data, 10 years of data, 30 organizations, both small and large complex environments, over 500 teams that we collected data from, up to multi-million-dollar programs, organizations with very significant and complex compliance and audit requirements. And sometimes we followed for in excess of 5 years, looking at their behaviors using these techniques from psychology. And paramount, we wanted to look at teams that were not just software teams. We wanted to get to what kinds of behaviors were we seeing. And so we looked at HR, finance, marketing change, social media, digital marketing, and software. In government agencies as well as corporates, leadership teams and executive teams using Scrum and other Agile frameworks to deliver their work. But these are the results, the model that we found. Using principal components analysis, longitudinal, we found that we were able to predict 85% of Agile behaviors with 4 primary factors. So 4 key behaviors were able to predict strong agility. And 50% comes from self-organization. The kinds of sub-factors out of self-organization did they have clear structure, goal clarity? Were they managing products, small batches, dependability? So the structures that managers put in place to support teams to be self-organizing, self-managing, that made up 50% of the model. The next 20% came from Agile values, the way people think differently about product management in Agile environments. So empiricism, self-improvement, decentralized decision-making, a shared purpose, servant leadership, connectedness. This made up the next 20%. 10% of the model came from the structure of short work cycles and fast feedback loops, how Agile were stakeholders in relation to their interaction with teams and programs, how do they manage backlogs, how do they optimize flow. And the last 5% from a focus on a continuous learning culture, being metrics-driven, value-focused, management commitment, systems thinking, team commitment and collaboration. And the remaining 15% out of 100, well, these reflected ultimately aspects of Wastefizz's model in organizational culture, things that were unique behaviors to the organization in the way that they visualized their work, their unique behaviors, attitudes, and rituals. The things that were unique to the organization made up the remaining 15% of the model that wasn't explained through Agile behavior. Overall, we call this model and the overall agility that this model reflects Agile IQ. We found that decrease in overtime was positively correlated with Agile IQ. So as Agile IQ increased, then overtime decreased. The other kinds of behaviors that we saw and the metrics that we pulled from the model is that defects and quality, defects decreased and rework decreased as Agile IQ increased. And we saw a significant cost saving for modeling of teams around 10 per month, the saving of roughly about 50K US dollars for teams that are about 10 by the time that they hit an Agile IQ of roughly about 110, 120. And longitudinally, we saw agile behaviors actually decrease. There were periods in time in which we saw teams, once they got to about, and programs, large programs, once they got to about 2.5 to 3 years, that their focus on these strong agile behaviors started to wane, particularly when leadership support started to wane, when leaders stopped exemplifying this behavior themselves, stopped supporting teams to be self-organizing. When those kinds of factors kicked in, we saw a decrease, and about a year to a year and a half before we would start to see recovery. So importantly, in the model, we're able to actually see trends towards drop-offs in behavior, which allowed then us to go, well, because we're seeing a drop-off, this is now an opportunity to then refocus leadership in order to support enterprise outcomes for agility. We also saw, particularly in COVID, very, very strongly that those teams that had very, very strong agile behaviors across the 4 factors and 23 sub-factors, by the time they hit an agile IQ of 130, they'd moved from an ability to pivot from about 3 months. So when something in the environment changed, from about 3 months to be able to initiate change in direction. We found that teams that had an agile IQ of 130, their ability to pivot to change was around about 2 weeks.
Yeah, and Matt, there was a question in the chat from Christina Rudolph saying, didn't COVID throw all the metrics out the window because of lack of predictability? What we found, which was quite exciting because we had so much data, was that when executives were very frightened during COVID and saying, oh my goodness, we're about to send all of our workers home and it's all going to be remote. How do we know that they're still going to be able to deliver? We looked at a lot of the team effectiveness studies in industry from Amy Edmondson and others, and we found that the factors that they were finding we could do in our model. And this, we did an analysis which Matt can show you a little bit later, but it actually helped us able to predict whether these teams were going to be able to pivot if we dramatically changed strategy and whether they'd be able to cope with going remote. So the behavioral characteristics of these teams, the factors that we were seeing actually was a predictor. The metrics were predictable of which teams we needed to focus on and which teams potentially needed more support and Scrum Master support and coaching. So it was something unexpected in COVID that we found the data actually did, which was kind of cool.
And Christina, your next question about diary studies bias the behavior perceived by the gatherer? Absolutely. Because we're human beings, being able to remove forms of cognitive bias is actually a difficult activity. But by using experts who are trained in understanding and being able to understand and analyze diaries and also complement those with naturalistic observation, etc. So not just one form, but a whole range of observational activities from psych we use. So not just one, but our assessors were expected to assess across a range of techniques.
Yeah, so we were able to tell those senior managers and executives that if your team's Agile IQ was, in the high hundreds, they probably would be able to easily cope with the pivots that you're going to need to make during COVID. And we tested that hypothesis and it proved to be right with one of our key program teams, which was really good to see.
Yeah, great to see 150 people when COVID hits and an executive goes, I actually want to change tact and we all need to move to be completely remote within 2 weeks. Done. Quite extraordinary to see. So that's the ability to pivot. And importantly, our findings after we did the modeling and we collected the data and looked at the insights, we then went to see what the rest of the research says about our findings. And research like from the effectiveness of self-management, 20% greater productivity in self-managing teams compared to traditionally managed teams. That's exactly what we saw in our research. Or from the research from industry, 22% feelings of greater well-being in self-managed teams, greater trust, personal growth. These are the kinds of things that we also saw in our own data. Our model, as we went through industry research, we found that industry research found pretty much exactly the same thing that our model predicts. even across things like delivery risk, ability to pivot, team effectiveness, psychological safety, and even the professional Scrum competency models. We saw really strong alignment between, in terms of delivery risk, we saw in the research, we saw great correlations to ours, the ability to pivot, Bain and Co., the types of factors that they reinforced, predicted an organization's ability to pivot. We found that the same. And even from psychological safety, clear structure, goal clarity, shared purpose, connectedness, value focus. When you go through Google's Project Aristotle, some great findings about what makes teams effective. We found strong relationships between their factors and ours. The implications for executive and leaders as a result of this model really quite clear, that a move from manager-led teams to self-managing product-based teams creates self-organization, predicts self-organization, promoting agile values. These factors are predictive of agile values, creating long-lived teams. These things create good, strong sprinting and a management commitment, and support for continuous improvement are the antecedents of a continuous learning culture. And these 4 behaviours predict, with a significant correlation, enterprise outcomes from agility, that things that from an enterprise perspective we really care about: improved productivity, lower costs, and lower risk. So we've described these behavioural stages that teams move through, and the kinds of clustering we saw across Agile IQ from 0 to 200. So same as a person's IQ, we tried to create a mental model around, this is a team's IQ and add their Agile IQ. Clusters of 5 going from starting to optimizing. And particular things we found that reflective of behaviour that helps teams move from one stage to the next in the model. And this is the Agile IQ playbook. It means that when teams start, the kinds of positive behaviours that we observed around, teams are thinking about Agile at this stage, and they might be using some practices, maybe doing stand-ups, for example. But the negative behaviours that we saw that kept teams from moving to the next stage, things like cold agile, Dunning-Kruger effect, still micromanagement and kind of management-led in terms of their work, even up to micromanagement. We saw behaviours like, but we deliver, so why should we change? So this need for homeostasis, to be able to kind of, well, we want to stay the way that we are, so can't we just tweak around the edges? And things like, well, we're pragmatic and you're just a purist because you want us to make us change. These are just reflections of a resistance to moving from this very embryonic stage to something greater. Because the key to growth, the behaviours that were key to growth from starting to the next stage are kicking in self-management, managers setting the guardrails, leading by example, metrics on Agile about let's move away from waterfall. And sometimes Kotter's burning platform for change were also effective, but typically self-management, one of the key aspects to helping teams move from this first stage into the next stage, which we call establishing. Positive behaviours that we saw in this, good baseline practices. So just doing good basic Scrum was enough with self-management to move teams from stage 1 to stage 2. Importantly, we saw strong commitment to change, because if you want the kinds of outcomes that we saw about improved ability to pivot and lower costs, you can't keep on doing the same thing. It requires a change in the way that you work. And so when we saw changes in behaviour, we saw teams move to stage 2. Some things that held teams in stage 2, particularly around the early stages, was them kind of trying to rationalise that, well, we always did this, or it's just common sense. Those kinds of things actually held them from advancing beyond stage 2. Because the key to growth from stage 2 to stage 3 was around supporting a growth mindset and mastering the basics. So doing the basics of Scrum in particular, just doing them really well. and then starting to experiment with adding additional practice like Kanban or extreme programming, for example. Those were the kinds of things, agile, user-centered practices on top of a good basic framework and practices, got them to stage 3. The stage 3, we call it evolving, and strong behaviors that we saw for stage 3 teams around empiricism, this really mindfulness around inspection and adaptation, looking at an increment in sprint review and getting feedback and adapting the product backlog in order to continuously deliver value. Some things we saw in negative behaviors around stage 3 were things like groupthink, which was, oh, well, we're awesome. And so rejecting any outside criticism. And sometimes when at large programs, we saw some in-group versus out-group dynamics, some jealousy between one group and another, one group perceiving themselves to be superior and acting in that way in order to essentially put other teams down. Those were some of the negative behaviors and quite destructive sometimes at scale. The key to growth out of stage 3 and into stage 4 was around a significant level of focus and discipline. Like, do they actually take this so seriously that they have an immense focus that creates a sense of flow out of it? Were they focused and did they collect metrics, lead time, cycle time? So are they starting to get into some aspects of lean? Are they actually focused on the impacts and outcomes that their work's going to create through creating and having product goals and sprint goals related to product goals? And if they had those things, we then saw teams evolve out of stage 3 into stage 4, which we call strengthening. So in stage 4, the positive behaviors that we saw that exemplify stage 4 are around lean and flow. They typically haven't abandoned Scrum. That's still a real centerpiece of the way that they think about agility. But they've added other layers and nuances on top of that. So lean and flow, some negative behaviors that we saw, and because we're in Australia, tall poppy syndromes, and we see that in some Northern European countries, where other teams see the immense success of stage 4 teams and try to kind of bring them down a notch. Maybe they're too successful. Maybe they need to be successful, but just quietly, not pose a threat to other teams in terms of how they look. Key aspects to growth out of stage 4 teams is to start thinking more about the whole system of people, process, and tools, not just their own team and how their own team performs, but how their team performs in relation to all of the other teams. And with that, moving out of kind of divisional silos to value streams. And with this, we did see some behaviors around stage 5 teams. Stage 5 teams we found quite rare. Not every team can start to think about systems thinking and think about other teams' needs in equal to their own. The kinds of positive behaviors we saw were these people helping other teams, managers, units, other divisions to be agile. And these were really the emerging leaders, particularly for agile communities of practice. Some negative behaviors, we did see the occasional hero work, like quite deliberate hero work from these teams. But overall, these were the teams that people started to look to create, lead, and grow communities of practice, not only for agility, but also for particular types of capabilities. These were the teams that other teams and managers would look to start our capability. Some questions from Mike. Does the ability to pivot, say within 2 weeks, indicate a high agile IQ? Absolutely. the higher a team's Agile IQ, the faster we saw their capability to pivot. So from a really kind of a stage one team around about 3-4 months, because they're still in stage one, still manager led, and so there's a delay of delivery of value. But as they started to move through, particularly around about stage 3, stage 4, particularly stage 4 teams, we saw teams and whole programs' ability to pivot reduce down to, and this is what the model predicts, by the time you get up to stage 4, the model predicts your ability to pivot should be around 2 weeks. Another question, can you practically apply your Agile IQ model in an organization? What is a step-by-step procedure? We're about, I'm going to show you some things because we turn this into something that you can use as well.
Yeah, we've actually used this model over a number of teams, some of them being sort of infrastructure teams and what we would call shared services team that are sort of integration teams, systems teams that have very routine work that is done every week, every month, same pattern. So, and they do just follow the bouncing balls in that sort of BAU, so business as usual work. So we did follow a number of those teams as well. Someone back when you were talking about level 4 asked what tall poppy syndrome is. That must be an Australian thing. In Australia, tall poppy syndrome is when someone has got to the peak and they're getting lots of praise and things like that. Australians will tear them down and try and, bring them back to, reality. So we give Chris Hemsworth, who's Thor, as you would all know, a really hard time here in Australia because he's too tall for his boots, kind of thing. So we try to remind him that he's just an Australian boy, nothing special. Yeah, that's what tall poppy syndrome is.
Yeah, and there's similar behaviours particularly we see in Northern Europe, and it has to do with social equality. Because if all teams are designed to deliver equally to enterprise outcomes, when some teams get a little bit too good, better than other teams, then we saw some rivalry that tended to go, well, let's remind ourselves that we're all in this together as a team of teams. And those are the kinds of behaviours that we saw out of tall poppy syndrome.
No, we still love Chris Hemsworth. I'm not giving him a bad time, but that's just the example. Yeah. In Australia, people would ignore him because, we're too, we don't want to acknowledge that he's that famous. We want to keep him grounded. Yeah.
So one of the things we did was actually put this into an app to make it easier for us to do assessments, etc. And we've made this available. It's in public beta at the moment. It's only in Android through an APK, basically a side load. But we're hoping by the time we get to April, it's going to be available as well as for iOS in the store for you to use. It's just one assessment. You do a baseline assessment with the same 85 questions. There's not like separate assessments for different kinds of things. It's just basically you reflect on the behaviors you see, it goes into the model, and out of the model will come a perspective of what is your stage in relation to the model, what's your team compared to another team of similar age, because the model recognizes quite deliberately that if your team is only 3 months old, well, maybe we should compare you to other teams that are 3 months old. And out of that, you get a dashboard with trends, and you can compare teams to a similar age, and you can export a PDF. It describes the stage quite well. From that, you can then go, great, this is what I can see around the 4 behavioral factors that predict the outcomes for Agile for the enterprise, around reduction in costs, reduction in overtime, improved digital, all of those things that you saw in those graphs about the outcome. And it provides you advice. If you want to go, well, I want to improve this behavior around Agile values, you can set a goal, and provides you curated recommendations around the goal that you're trying to improve for that stage of improvement. And if there is a particular kind of certification from Scrum.org that it feels that because of the nature of the improvement that you're doing, it'll provide recommendations around that kind of training. For executive, and this is something we did quite early as we started to capture this data, we provided an enterprise perspective of what was going on with teams. And because we're comparing behavior with behavior, we're not like comparing velocity, because as you know, a team's velocity is quite unique to the conversations and estimations it creates, but you can compare behavior. And so that's exactly what we did around the dashboard, to look at the aspects of the behaviors, ability to pivot, agile leadership, team effectiveness, psychological safety, and the agile IQ across whole programs. These were the kinds of things we're able to provide within a dashboard. And certainly if you start using that, the app and go through these things, this is something that you can see too. Because we understand the model is tied to cost savings as well, that's part of the dashboard. You can, by this particular stage, the projected savings because of the level of agility are this. There's Power BI, because obviously people like to create their own dashboards. So we developed a shadow database that means you can have access to the metrics that are output from the model, and then compare teams and compare the growth of various aspects of the factors and sub-factors across time.
Yeah, and the clients that are using this this dashboard, it doesn't replace their velocity metrics and all of those other things that they're measuring. It's actually complementary data on behavioral aspects that help them predict how teams are going. So it's not seen as an either or, it's seen as a complementary piece of information for management that they didn't previously have.
Yeah, absolutely. Because these are the kinds of aspects that, as we go through our final thoughts, that what our traditional metrics do is gives a picture of what has happened. And that's good. That's absolutely what we need. What has happened? Tell us about delivery. What does our velocity look like? What does our cumulative flow? What does our defects look like when we sit at this particular point in time and look backwards? That's what traditional reporting is all about, providing confidence and transparency to decision makers about what has happened. But it doesn't provide us a picture of what will happen. Because for that, we need much more complicated data analytics models to answer the questions: why are some teams more agile? What will make teams more agile? What recommendations can you give us to make it repeatable and scalable? Traditional reporting answers what has happened. When we're wanting insight and foresight, then we need predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics, and that's what the Agile IQ model actually does. It means that in terms of enterprise agility, how agile is your organization? How agile are your teams and programs? And are you on track to get Agile's benefits? Because we don't do Agile because we do Agile. We do Agile for these kinds of benefits of improved ability to pivot. So these four key behaviors around Agile values, sprinting, self-organization, and continuous learning culture, these four behaviors and their sub-factors provide us predictive analytics around what's the ability to pivot. Are teams effective? Do we have agile leadership? The four behaviors predict reduction in costs and reduction in overtime, improved output. They predict delivery risk. What behaviors are going to support delivery if and when we move away from being face-to-face and collaborative to being distributed. So these behaviors provide predictive analytics around these kinds of outcomes, which are directly correlated to our enterprise outcomes for agility, which is improved productivity, reduction in costs, and importantly, reduction in risk.
We seem to have lots of questions. So yeah, I mean, I guess we just start at the top, Lindsay. Are you happy with that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Or do we start from the bottom? I don't know which order they came in.
But you can go to agile.iq.com. You can read the information there, sign up for the beta. We'll send you manually at this stage. We'll send you a key that you can use for your trial. It's 30 days. And start to answer questions and see whether or not you, how agile are you? How agile are your teams? How agile is your program?
Yeah. Okay, so we might, if we go back to the questions things, Matt, Maduka, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. He asked how you can practically apply the Agile IQ model in your organization and what's the step-by-step procedure. We've had this model in the app, I guess, for the last 18 months, but prior to that, it was all manual. But how we do it step by step when we're going to an organization, obviously we're sometimes going in as Agile coaches for a program. Sometimes we're going in for Scrum Masters for a couple of teams. And what we do is we do a baseline assessment, and that's where the 85 questions gives us that good comprehensive baseline. And that's the questions were very much based on the Scrum Guide, Agile Manifesto, and a number of other things from industry research. But what we found was you go in and do that baseline, and then we would test the team maybe a sprint later or maybe a month later and do it that way. Other ways that we've used it is to actually do a pulse check at the beginning of an engagement where we've gone in as an Agile coach or an Agile consultant and just given the executive a view of, you know, where do we think you're at and what do you think we can help you with? And that's kind of how we use it in the beginning. Then over time, we hand the tool eventually over to the client and they manage this all themselves. But it's in the initial stages, we do it as an expert review that we're doing as the Agile coach. So in the version, there's different smarts you get if you're an Agile coach, and there's some great reports that spit out every time you do one of the questionnaires so that you can actually give that to your executive. So there's lots of tools in there for Agile coaches. And that's how we tend to use it in our own business as Agile consultants. Our clients tell us that they use it sometimes for retrospectives. So we're finding new, different ways of using it all the time. But the step-by-step process is essentially we go in and do a baseline, we give the teams the improvement goals, and then we talk through with the Scrum Master, how can he help the team, the organization, the product owner, depending on what their goal is. And then we would come back and assess at different points in time. And over time, particularly when we're following some of these clients for a number of years, that's how we've been able to get good data. What we do in the app is compare them to teams of similar age, rather than, you know, against the whole database, because if I'm only 3 months into my Scrum journey or only been a Scrum team for 3 months, I don't want to compare myself to a team that's been going for 3 years. So we try to make it as contextual as we can. And that's the step-by-step of how I use it as an Agile practitioner. Have you got anything to add there, Matt?
No, not really. Just that the beauty about having a data analytics model is that the baseline assessment is 85 questions. You respond in relation to what you observe in relation to the behavior. If you don't see it, you go, no, I don't see it. If you see it, then the behavior is very strong. You just mark it at that. And then out of that assessment provides you with the metrics and provides you with descriptions around what stage your team is at and the things that you need to do to move from the current stage to the next stage. If you want to then go into, will provide me with some recommendations for specific areas of improvement, then the app will provide you with those. So there's no extra metrics that you need to actually start to kind of put into it. That's what the data model is for. It's very much like the weather. You know, you can always, if you want to know what tomorrow's weather is, you can kind of look out the window and go, oh, today is a good predictor of tomorrow's weather. But weather modeling is actually very, very complex, and it's got a huge amount of data that goes on today and tomorrow. We know that for the last 20 years, these kinds of things have happened, these kinds of atmospheric. So it basically takes in a whole range of things and puts it into the data model to provide you a view of this is what the weather's going to be like tomorrow or the next 10 days. That's what the Agile IQ model does. Puts your behavioral observations into that, and it spits out the recommendations of this is where the team's at, this is what it takes to get to the next level. Once you've done a baseline assessment, you don't need to do more. You don't need to do a full baseline assessment. You can just answer up. I think the quick assessments are only 20 questions. But again, it's just questions. You put the behavioral questions into the data model, and it will then spit out what it observes, what it understands about your team in relation to that model.
Yeah, so the initial baseline is 85 questions, but then you can do a randomized sample of about 20 questions for subsequent ones, you know, for future as well. And that's actually quite a nice pattern to use for retrospectives. If you have a team where their maturity is at that you actually want them to do a self-assessment, we do build Dunning-Kruger into the app. So we ask a few more questions about the team so that we can account for some of that that aspect in that.
Some of the there's clear behavioural aspects that help us understand how a team thinks about itself, as well as how the assessor thinks about himself. And so some of the profiling questions that are included in it go into the model. And of course, the model's always learning, so it adjusts and changes and evolves as it understands about what things help to lead a team through those stages. So John asked some really interesting questions about like has the data been broken down to show the impact on business metrics, increased employee happiness by maturity stages, etc. We're continuing to look at and analyze our data, and we have found some early aspects of things around so increased employee happiness. What we found is that there is no correlation between just team happiness and their level of agility. But like we found with Google's Project Aristotle, team effectiveness, though, is a very different set of factors. Our team's effective involves a multifaceted set of factors that are statistically significant in relation to the model.
And that was more about goal clarity, shared purpose, things like that, are much better predictors of their agility and their effectiveness as a team. We probably need to move on because we've already got through one. So the next one was about industry. Research was done in any industry or software industry only. It was a combination of industries. We had business teams in marketing, HR, retail. We even had a hardware group and a liquor group. So what liquor, that's not Australian, that's everywhere, alcohol. So we had a lot of teams that were sort of retail teams as well as finance teams and other teams. So it wasn't just purely software. So we've actually tested it across the market. The next one you can take, Matt, it's from Daniel. What are the specific enterprise outcome metrics that you're using to characterize agility?
Reduction in overtime, which is directly correlated with rework and cost savings. What other ones did we collect, Mia, around?
So it was definitely about cost. It was quality. So increased quality, and that the cost savings also correlated to being able to produce more. So it wasn't that they got money back in the bank per se. It was that they could use that additional money that they didn't spend fixing up defects and quality problems with producing more features, producing more product, which ultimately led to when you were looking at sort of usage index and customer value, much higher correlation there, because we found very early on with executives, they didn't want to talk agility per se. They wanted to know, well, is this going to make my share price go up? Is this going to give me more money? Is this going to reduce my risk? So we really had to talk to them in the language that executives talk about, because they don't care about velocity. They don't care about values and happiness. They care about, are my customers happy? Did I get more customers? Did I retain more customers? And did I get more stuff out to them that made them, more likely to buy from me? Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And he asks, is this process always linear? It's a really complicated question because we've got basically 23 sets of behaviors that are, in statistical language, are orthogonal, means that they're tightly related. So there's not a linear relationship between any of the stages. But what we found was that there were archetypal behaviors that were unique to each stage. And so what I've really provided you with in relation to the 5 stages are a high level view of what the data model recognizes as archetypal behaviors from stage 1 through to stage 5. Realistically, one of the biggest behavioral differences between stage 1 and 2 and stages 3 to 5 was, are teams self-organizing and self-managing and cross-functional? That was kind of like, that's 50% of the model. So if you can do that and actually support teams to be self-organizing, self-managing, cross-functional, all the things that great Scrum Masters do with their teams, you're halfway there. It was the biggest behavioral difference between, particularly between stages 1 and 2 and stages 3 and higher. When we got much deeper, there were some subtle differences between stage 1 and stage 2, and certainly some really, really big differences between stage 3, 4, and 5. Systems thinking we only really saw in stage 5 teams. So the behavior was stronger in stage 5 than stage 4 and stage 3. Did I see some, and did our consultants in collecting data, did we see some systems thinking in stage 3? Yes, but the behavior was much stronger and much more prevalent and much more overt in stage 5. So because we've got many, many behaviors at play, it's not really linear. It's just that there are strengths of behaviors that change and evolve between stage 1 and stage 5.
Yeah, I just zooming through because I know we're running out of time. Um, I think there was a question about whether we talked about it was with teams of 10 with the cost savings. Look, we also have a lot of smaller teams in the database as well. We just did the modeling on costing for that particular team size, but you could probably extrapolate it out to the smaller team size. Probably something to think about for the dashboard. You can put in your team size and it could work it out for us. Because we are trying to build those sort of smarts into it. Yeah.
Part of the team profile, when you enter some team information, it asks you for your team size, whether your Scrum Master is part-time or full-time, for example. If you don't have a Scrum Master, don't answer either because it's not compulsory. But the team size actually then inputs that into, I've just provided you the view of what a team size of 10 looks like in terms of cost savings, but the data model will adjust your predicted cost savings based on your team size. So if you've got a team of 5, it'll adjust it, it'll put that information in, it'll put it into the model, and the model will predict what your cost savings are for whatever team size you have.
Yeah, and then there was a question from Philip asking about this is effective on teams. You also measure the whole organization. And that's what the dashboard and the Power BI is about, because you can start looking at teams of teams and comparing programs as well. So we found that one organization where we had over 60 Scrum teams that were working, and they were across 6 different programs, we were able to look at their organizational agility as a result and be able to give them that picture of where their maturity was as an organization. They were 3 years into their Agile journey at that point in time. They're now about 5 years when we've finished looking at them. But yeah, over that time, we were able to see them move from it being just, something in a particular team in an area to now actually be the way they work in that whole organization, of about there's 60,000 people working in that organization. So this started with, 10 teams, 40 teams, 60 teams, and now it's across the whole organization. There's still some pockets holding out, but yeah, they've been able to get great organizational agility data out of that.
Tyler asks a great question around approaches successful for shifting teams to being self-organizing. There's a really great video and book, etc., by David Marquette called "Turn the Ship Around," where he describes as a submarine captain how he actually moved from being a command and control military Navy guy managing a submarine to what he calls giving intent. If you're interested in what it really takes to move from command and control to self-organization, it's a great video. Google it. It's a great video that you'll find on YouTube. We get this high-level perspective of what he did to move to having basically self-organizing teams. That's basically the start of it. How do I, if I'm a manager, what kind of rules do I set up, guardrails that they're called, so that I define what those are, provide clear structure and clarity about those aspects, and say, great, as a team, here are your rules, deliver outcomes within these particular constraints. So David Marquette, Turn the Ship Around, a great resource to start off with, understanding what does it really take to move to being self-organizing.
There's a couple of questions from Anud and Ludik, which are very, very similar. Is it a good idea to be comparing teams? We don't want to have them think that some are good and bad. Should we be using comparable metrics for teams to check how they're doing? That's essentially what we're trying to do. I don't actually, when I'm doing this, teams don't even know they're being assessed. It's more me as their coach doing this, and then I'm using it as a coaching tool to kind of help me see where I should focus my time and maybe what are some of the things that I should be focusing on with that team. So it does actually give me those prompts. I don't actually show teams. I don't put the list of the top team and the bottom team. For the dashboard, we do make that available to their managers, but we certainly we have sort of used it with them to kind of say, it's not to say one team is better than the other. All of your different teams have all started at different things. So much like velocity, it's not meant to be say, these are your good teams, these are your bad teams, because everyone's on their journey. As we know that, any mix of change in the team is going to make it that, you're going to have some sort of ebbs and flows in that. So it's certainly not meant to be a comparative tool in the same way that you don't compare velocity across teams, but it does, when you bubble it up at the program level, give you an idea of the health or how your program is going. So, that is sort of not the intent of it is to compare. It's not to compare teams.
No.
You want to answer them?
It's a diagnostic tool. Like if you're going to understand, how do I create awesome agile teams? How do I help teams to have awesome outcomes from the enterprise? It'll quite clearly take the behaviors that you observed, put it into the modeling. This is roughly where they are. And importantly, this is what it takes to get to the next level. And if you've got many teams, it'll provide you a clear perspective of the teams that are in need, the areas that they are in need of support, so that you can go, great, to uplift my whole organization, my teams of teams to create stronger enterprise outcomes. These are the teams that I should be focusing on to coach and support and nurture, to help them lift their game, so I get great enterprise outcomes like improved ability to pivot, greater cost saving, greater throughput. If you're interested just go to agiliq.com and you can find our contact information if you want to reach out to us from there. Lindsay, I'm sure, will send out, there's a white paper that we've written about the data and nature of the data and the factors that we found. It's the easiest way to either sign up, agiliq.com, or to download the white paper to find out more about how these factors work.
Yeah, and as a professional Scrum trainer, I use this tool a lot to kind of say, okay, you're at the maturity now. I know everyone's done their PSM. To get you to the next level, maybe PSM 2 is what you should do. So that's how we kind of also use it to help them with training, because this doesn't replace training. This doesn't replace the Agile coach, but it just gives them some help to focus on some improvement goals that they can set, and they're in control of it. So all those Fitbit monitors that you have for your steps, we kind of think about this as the Fitbit for your agility and something easy like that to do. And that's how we use it. And certainly if you are a PST and you're interested, we are interested in partnering with you and looking at some sort of partnership arrangement there. So please reach out to us as well. I don't know, Lindsay, if we have more time. I know we're at our time box and there's a lot more questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to them all.
Yes. So we will Matt and Mia will answer questions offline. I'll share all of the remaining questions with them, so we'll be able to answer them. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. Matt, if you could just advance to the next slide so we can close out.
This one. Ta-da.
Yeah, so we always encourage you to continue your learning. So please visit the Scrum.org website. There are a bunch of digital learning paths. And next slide. We also have our social media channels. Please follow us there and on our forums. And check out our upcoming Scrum Pulse webinars as well on our website. Thank you all for joining today. Special thanks to Matthew and Mia. This has been a really great presentation and we really appreciate it. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank
See you
you.
later. Thanks, everyone.